Welcome to the Ozarks, nearly 47,000 square miles of rolling hills and rugged mountains, as well as endless greenery. I've driven through the Ozarks hundreds of times, and I can tell you with all honesty, it's a place you don't want to find yourself stranded after dark. You begin to wonder what's been eating the remains of the deer a little too far off the side of the empty road. What could be making those heavy, deliberate footsteps? And you wonder if that horrific screaming is coming from you or the shadow at the edge of the trees. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories from the Ozarks, and be sure to send me your terrifying tales at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear stories from the Rocky Mountains. Also, let me know in the comments what other geographic locations you want to hear stories from next. For example, the Sierra Nevada or Yellowstone National Park. Also, be sure to follow the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and iTunes if you'd rather listen hands-free. Leave us a review on iTunes too if you can. Thank you. Now, let's begin. These first two stories do feature animal violence, such as hunting and animal attacks. Timestamps are in the description. The Howler, from Sneeves0426. Hi, my name is Sam, and I live in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. I've lived here all my life, and I've been hunting in these mountains since I was a boy with my father. I'm also a heavy believer in the supernatural and in cryptids. Dogmen, Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and Wendigo. These have gotten me intrigued in the superstitious. But here in Arkansas we have a legend, and I'm sure you've heard of a legend here. And let me tell you, this legend is very, very real. This is the story of my encounter with the infamous Ozark Howler. It was a cold, misty night in the mountains of the Ozark landscape. My father and I were gathering some firewood for the family. We lived in a cabin that we built ourselves, with my dad being brought up in these mountains by my grandfather, and his by my great-grandfather. Our family consisted of my stepmother and my two younger siblings. I was the oldest of my two siblings. I'm currently 21 and own a couple of firearms, but back then we hunted with an 1870 antique Winchester repeater and a Krag Jorgensen rifle, or better known as the bolt-action rifle that was passed down by my grandfather and was used to hunt game back when trapping was a big thing in the States. Now, we use these weapons as a token of our appreciation to our ancestors. I also use a standard hunting knife and a crossbow whenever I go hunting. We go out hunting often, and we haven't seen much this past winter. We'd see the occasional bear or the occasional mountain lion, but not many deer this season, which was odd, as they are abundant in these mountains. While we were gathering some firewood outside, we heard a howl in the distance. I've heard these howls before, and mostly I assume it to be some coyotes, a fox, or maybe a lone cougar. It was also much colder than normal this night, and as we were chopping the firewood, my father looked at me with sweat dripping down his face. He said, "How's it going over there, champ?" I responded, "Just fine, Dad. It's a lot colder than normal tonight. What do you say we go hunting for game soon? The kids are probably hungry."
"Yeah, I think we should. We don't want to keep the family waiting."
So we went on inside the cabin to gather our weapons. I took my Winchester repeater and my crossbow, and my father took his Krag Jorgensen rifle and his pump-action shotgun. We let my stepmom know we were going to go hunting. Then we set off into the cold, wintry night. We decided to take a trail that was all too familiar to us, to see if we could catch ourselves a big buck or a doe, which would be lucky for us. I was walking through the snow, listening closely to anything that could be lurking in these woods. Luckily, it was a clear night, and the moon was full, so I could see ahead of me. In these mountains, we had all sorts of encounters ranging from bison to cougars, but this time it felt different. The woods were eerily quiet. I felt like something was watching me from the tree line. All I could hear was the beating of my heartbeat and the sounds of our footsteps in the snow. And then we heard it a loud, very eerie howl that made my blood go cold. I tried to focus on where the sound came from. I looked over at my father, and even he seemed to be on edge. I asked him, "What do you think that was?"
"I don't know, son, but I think we should keep it quiet and see if we can down a deer for dinner."
I noticed his hands were trembling, but it was a good sight to see that he wanted to keep going. So I went along with him. You see, my dad is fearless, and he's quite a strong man. From what I know, no one would want to mess with him, and to see him want to continue our hunt was a good sign. I kept on listening closely to the sounds that surrounded us as the forest became alive again. Soon I heard something to our left, and up ahead I saw a deer come into the clearing. It was a buck with a very nice set of antlers. He seemed to have not noticed us yet. I quickly but quietly got my crossbow out because I didn't want to frighten the deer. I loaded the crossbow, took aim at the heart of the big buck, and fired. I saw it pierce through the skin of the buck as he tried to run away with the arrow stuck to his heart. We followed the blood trail to the now injured deer as it was letting out cries of pain. I took out my hunting knife and with an act of mercy, I put it down. After that, we heard something to the right of us. I looked down into the tree line to see if anything was there, and I heard a low, deep, guttural growl. I froze in fear. Whatever it was sounded intimidating. But it was odd, as in Arkansas, the largest animals around here were bison or bears. Whatever this thing was did not sound like any predator that hunts in the region. My dad picked up the carcass of the dead deer and put it on his shoulders. He signaled me to follow. As we were making our way back to the cabin, I kept hearing heavy footsteps follow us every few meters. I kept looking around to see if I could catch a glimpse of what it was, and then I saw it. To the left of me, I saw a huge shape moving slowly next to us. It was gigantic. It looked like a grizzly bear to me, but it's odd to see anything this big in these woods. I signaled my dad to look. He turned around and saw it as well and said quietly to me, "Stay close to me. As long as we stay quiet and move quietly, we'll be okay." I nodded my head. We began to sneak our way back to the cabin. We managed to make it back in about 15 minutes. Both my dad and I were on edge as we moved back to the cabin. Along the way, we heard the occasional growl and howl, as it seemed to be taunting us. As we moved into the clearing near the cabin, I heard a booming set of footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the same creature, except this time, I could see it clearly. It did look like a grizzly bear, but with horns and eyes glowing a bright crimson blood red. My dad and I screamed as we ran back to the cabin. We made it just in time to close the door, as whatever the creature was hit the door with brute force. My dad began to panic, placing the deer down and rushing the kids and my stepmother upstairs. I kept on hearing this creature scratching at the door, and every so often it tried to break the door down. It roared so loud my ears began to ring. I decided I was going to try to scare it away. I went upstairs to my bedroom window, opened it up, and got my Winchester ready. I had the massive beast in my sights as I fired at it. After I hit it, it let out a roar and ran back into the woods with the earth shaking behind its every step. Everything went quiet again after that. I ran downstairs and looked outside to see nothing but large footprints in the snow. I opened the door and looked at the damage the creature caused, and all I saw were huge scratch marks. I then went to the footprints left by the creature, and to my surprise, There was no blood, even though I'm sure I shot it. It was only after this event that I discovered the legend of the Ozark Howler. Occasionally we do hear its howl at night, but my dad and I have learned to respect it. I haven't seen the beast to this day, but Ozark Howler, let's never meet again. The Forest, from John J. I live in a house in Oklahoma, out in the Ozarks. In my time here, since I moved here in 2005 so me and my wife could live close to her parents, I've encountered many things, whether it be supernatural or not. I've seen flashing lights zip through the sky and heard strange howls during morning hikes. Just last week, when my wife drove to the store in town with our 2 kids, they saw huge muddy prints on the porch when they got back. And when she got inside, the dogs were shaken. But the scariest encounter I had was when my brother was visiting us from Utah. He, his wife, and their 3 kids stayed for the week. It was supposed to be a fun week of hiking, hunting, and fishing on our vast property. Our fairly big house was packed with 5 kids and 4 adults, so it's safe to say outside time was much less stressful for me. Nothing happened the first 3 nights, but on the 4th, things started to feel off. When me, my brother, my son, and his eldest son went hunting, something felt weird. I walked faster and faster until I realized I was jogging slowly and I was ahead of our group. Everyone asked why I was rushing like that. I just responded by saying, I don't want to get to the spot too late, that's all. Deep down, I knew I was scared of something watching us. I swear I could hear breathing outside our own. We got to our spot that was perfect for hunting. It was on the far side of the property, so there were more deer here. 3 hours later, and we had nothing. It was getting dark and my son and nephew were bored, so they began to skip rocks in the creek. It was then when we realized the whole time it was very quiet. It was so silent, it was weird and scary to us. My brother made an excuse that we should go home to eat, so we began to walk back, defeated. In front of us as we walked back home, we began to hear a crunch in the woods, and a yell so loud it couldn't be human. It sounded like a screaming girl and a bear mixed into one. I tried to tell myself it was just a mountain lion, but just then, I saw it. A large creature ran across the path. I fell back in shock. The thing had long fur, and it was big like a bear with glowing eyes. I would have said it was a bear, but the horns on it told me otherwise. I tried to think of what it was, but I mainly saw its face and some of the body. We ran home, but I kept telling myself it was a ram or something, but deep down, I knew what I saw was a monster. We were almost home when we heard something running behind us along the trail. It was so fast, we nearly had no time to react. We jumped out of the way, and my brother tried to take a shot at it. I fired at it as well, but the creature ran away into the forest. We recovered quickly and ran inside the house, unaware that everyone else was watching from the back porch after hearing the gunshots. We ran inside, locking the doors and closing the windows, all while trying to explain the situation to everyone in there. My youngest niece, who was only 8 at the time, freaked out. She ran to her older brothers and my kids. Together, they all huddled up scared. My eldest son held his rifle tightly while shaking. After a while, we all sat at the couch trying to forget by watching some TV and playing board games after dinner. But we couldn't think clear. We were all just listening for any sudden moves outside. Our 3 dogs were also scared out of their minds. Even the 2 big ones who stay outside were in here after my daughter protested the idea of them sleeping out there with that monster near us. As the evening progressed, one by one, everyone went to sleep, until the adults were the only ones awake. We played poker and drank coffee until about 11:30, when our dogs went ballistic, barking and jumping and running around, waking everyone. Then we heard a crashing sound from the shop outside. We all were terrified. We grabbed our guns, which were at the ready, and ran out there. My son and nephew were in pursuit behind us. We fired towards the shop, and then crash, it came running out. We all fired at it, a rain of bullets hitting it, yet the creature didn't fall. My brother shot at it too. He knows he hit the side of it. It ran off making noises that sounded like it was running out of air. We all froze. Soon after, my wife and sister-in-law called in my son and nephew. My brother and I decided to see where the thing had went. With our blood pumping, we tracked it, but the tracks quickly ended at one of the creeks on our property. We went back to clean up the shop mess. I was beginning to calm down until I saw the mess of my tools all across the floor, and the old truck I'd been trying to restore had been dented. We cleaned up what we could, then we went inside to sleep, all the while hearing the howls again. That really scared me, but the howls were different. It sounded hurt and sad. Soon the howls were more distant. I almost felt bad for it, but then I remembered that it tried to kill me and my family, and it ruined months of work on that old truck. The next morning was normal, and we didn't mention it. That morning I went down the dirt road leading to my neighbor's. I asked him if he'd heard anything last night. He said, "Yeah," in a shaky voice. He then pointed to a hole in the ground. "That thing killed my dog." We talked for a little while. He explained the creature came around 9 o'clock and attacked his dog. He scared it away with a shotgun, but it was too late. I went back home once we were done talking to fix up my shop some more and break the news to my daughter that the neighbor's dog, who she was fond of, had died. The next few days were normal. I thought of the events of that night less and less, and when my brother's family left, things went back to normal. Before I knew it, my week off from work was over. As the years went by, I forgot about the thing more and more, until now, 5 years later, because my brother is coming to visit again in a few weeks with the family. I was happy for a little bit, thinking about being with my brother and my son who's coming back from college for winter break. And then I was reminded about that night. It was years ago, but thinking about it gives me chills. I guess the upside is that it's going to make a good conversation near the fire when they do get here. A Haunted High School in the Ozarks, from J.D. A coworker told me this unforgettable story about his time in high school. I'm going to write this from his perspective. Central High School in Springfield, Missouri is haunted. I know what you're thinking. Every kid says their school is haunted. But my story is different. I saw it. Central was actually the first high school in Springfield. The original brick building with its tower still stands, but has now expanded with many new wings. We'd all heard the stories about the steam tunnels that connected the buildings and the supposed hangings, but far more compelling was the story of the deadly principal who would whip troublesome students to death. That would have happened long ago when Springfield was a small town and not the Queen City of the Ozarks. We had heard the rumors, the stories that were likely exaggerated, but being high schoolers, we knew we had to do one thing: be at the school late at night. I was the one who came up with the idea that we needed to join the drama class. They were preparing a performance of South Pacific, and as I explained to my group of friends, the way to get in would be to join the class as stagehands, stay to clean up after the performance, and then just stay. And that was what we did. Well, only a couple of us actually got onto the crew, but after everyone else had left, letting the others in was simple. We split up into 3 pairs, myself and Sarah, Rich and Paul, and Michelle and Dan. We didn't have flashlights, and this was before we had cell phones, but the moonlight from the windows and the familiarity of the halls allowed us to get around the school very easily. After about an hour, we began to think perhaps the stories were just stories. We began to make our way to the gymnasium. We started to compare experiences, but everyone said the same thing. They hadn't seen anything nor heard anything strange. And that's when a chair flew across the gym and slammed into the wall. "What the heck?" I gasped before I saw something else. Swarms of glittering little things crawling across the floor. They were cockroaches. We'd see cockroaches in the gym on occasion, but usually 1 or 2, not hundreds. "Let's get out of here," yelled Michelle, and we hurried to the nearest exit, a stairway leading up to the 2nd floor. It wasn't until we got upstairs that we realized that going upstairs probably wasn't the best course of action, but the cockroaches didn't seem to follow us there. As we stood next to a classroom, catching our breath, we heard loud footsteps down the hall. All of us backed up against the wall, trying to let whatever this was just pass by. As the loud, plodding footsteps came nearer, our tension grew higher. "Oh, screw this," Rich said, and he ran into a classroom, Sarah following quickly after him. The door slammed shut behind them. "Guys!" I called. I almost didn't notice that the footsteps had stopped. Suddenly, we heard them scream and something slammed against the wall. And then something else hit it. They kept on screaming. Paul pulled at the door, but the handle was stuck. Finally, after a few minutes of them screaming and something hitting the wall, it opened. We entered the classroom. All the desks and chairs were knocked over, and some had clearly been hitting the walls. How they'd gone that far was a mystery, as they were pretty heavy. We found Sarah crouched in a corner crying and babbling incoherently, a puddle of moisture underneath her. Rich, on the other hand, was stumbling toward the window. "Get him!" I called, and Dan ran towards Rich, grabbing him. "Let me go. Just let me jump. Let me die," Rich cried. "Guys, this is enough," I said. "We need to get out of here." Michelle and Paul helped Sarah up, and helping Dan with Rich, we made our way back into the hall. As we stepped into the hallway, all at once, all the doors slammed shut. Then they all opened again and slammed again. "Screw this," Michelle yelled, and she and Paul began hurrying down the stairs, supporting Sarah between them. Dan ran after them, and I pulled Rich after me. The cockroaches downstairs had seemingly dispersed as we made our way to the nearest exit. Pushing at the door, nothing seemed to happen. "Come on, push it!" Michelle yelled, and Paul, Dan, and I struck the door together, forcing it open. We pulled Sarah and Rich outside, and as we made our way to the cars, we heard the door behind us slam shut. Dan helped Rich to his car while Michelle and Paul brought Sarah to the car they'd arrived in. As for me, I ran to my own car. As I was about to climb inside, I happened to look back at the school, looking at the tower. There, in the top room, was a window. And very clearly, I could see the outline of someone looking out the window directly at us as we made our escape. It was then I realized the most horrifying thing of all, that we knew there was something in the high school. It knew we knew, and we had to go back to class on Monday. Encounter with a Bear, from LaDonna Steele. This happened in 2015 in November. We had bought a piece of land in Highland, Arkansas. For those of you who don't know Arkansas, Highland is between Ash Flat and Hardy near the Missouri border, just under Thayer. It is extremely rugged and woody, with jagged cliffs and hills that would make a billy goat say ouch. Well, our land hadn't been cleared of trees, vines, or rocks ever. It was as wild as you can get. Plenty of copperhead snakes, too. We set up our tent to stay the night and got a good-sized fire going. It was a little chilly. As soon as we settled down for the night, it got really nice and quiet. The partial moon was beautiful, just what you camp for. I couldn't sleep, but my husband was out like a light, so I got up and went outside the tent. I tended the fire a bit and whatnot, trying to get sleepy enough. Now, I'm a trucker, so wild things never scare me unless they're bigger than me. I'm 5'2" and about 160 pounds, strong like stocky strong. You have to be strong if you drive a truck, and willing to go the extra mile if you have to. About 1:30 in the morning, I hear something coming through the knee-high leaves. Something big. Humans sound different when they walk through leaves, so do deer. But this was large and bulky, and it didn't care if you heard it or not. Now, me and hubby had only brought a .22 long rifle with us. We hadn't taken into account that we might run into a predator able to kill us. Way too much city living. This thing is completely black and moving like it has no cares in the world. It could see me, but I couldn't see it fully. Fire is a great thing sometimes. What I mean by that is you can't see anything past the glow of the fire. It's like a wall of light and you're blind. It moves past me to my right at exactly 25 feet out, just out of reach of my small, crappy flashlight, dang it. I think to myself, as I'm wanting that spotlight we left at the house, I didn't think we would need something you could flag a 747 down with. I have an iron rod I was stirring the fire with in one hand, the crappy flashlight in the other. Turning to face the invisible stalker as it circles to the rear of our tent, I walk to the sound of its feet going through the leaves. I'm trying to stay away enough to be able to fight it if I had to. I still don't have a clue what it is. My flashlight beam lands on its eyeshine, great blue eyes. I know from hunting deer they have red eyeshine, and most animals have a red or yellow eyeshine. 100% of the time, blue means cows or horses or bears. Now this eyeshine was a brilliant, beautiful blue. So I run at it, saying, "Ha! Ha!" in as deep a voice as I can muster, just a step or two, stomping. It then stands up on its back 2 legs, and I kid you not, it sniffs me. Now real fear is kicking in like a mother. I now know exactly what it is, and we only have a .22. Shaking, I stand my ground, letting it know I will not back down. It walks off into the fallen trees and brush where I have no hope of seeing it for the rest of the night. That's right, it stayed out of sight, but it stayed there making sounds like sniffing and grunting all night until it was almost dawn. I guess that's the best I've been scared of any animal on Earth. I think all he wanted was the hamburgers we bought, as fast food is a weakness of most bears. I thank God he didn't want those stupid things enough to maul me to death. Do not bring food on overnights in the Ozarks, people. It ain't worth your life. The following story is from an episode from last year, titled 5 Scary Stories to Fall Asleep To. It matches this theme, so I've decided to add it. They told me they'd leave you alone. From Pity K. They told me they'd leave you alone. I remembered this story when I was driving home late the other night, and just thinking about it really creeped me out. This didn't happen to me, but I did hear it from my ex-girlfriend's grandma years ago, about a friend of hers. We'll call her Grandma Z. Z worked as a therapeutic masseuse at a spa in a nice little town in northwest Arkansas. To give you a bit of an idea of what kind of person Z was, she lived in a little stone cottage with a shrine to a Hindu holy man as its centerpiece, and she carried pipe tobacco in her Volvo to sprinkle on roadkill. Now, she claimed it was a Native American ritual to help ferry the animal's spirit into the next life, or something along those lines. She was a nice enough woman, but obviously a bit eccentric. That being said, she seemed sincere and a little more than creeped out when she told us her story. Another masseuse that Z was close to at the spa, I'll call her M, arrived at work one day in the middle of the week in a haggard state. M was a young woman in her early 30s. She was friendly, and most of the time she had a bubbly personality. But on that day, she was aloof, downcast, and had bags under her eyes. Z noticed this the moment she walked in the door, but with work to do, she waited for a better time to ask M if everything was okay. When lunch came around, Z approached her friend and asked what was wrong. M brushed it off initially, saying that nothing was wrong, that she was simply tired. But Z persisted. M began to tear up then, and started to sob. Z embraced her and told her it was going to be all right, that she could share what was on her mind if she needed to. M's sobs subsided a little, and she began to speak, but then stopped. What she had to say, she told Z, was too crazy, and Z would never believe her. Z told M that she'd be surprised at what she may or may not find believable. So M composed herself a bit, and then began her story. M, her husband, and young son lived in a house about 20 miles outside of town. The house and the property were beautiful, essentially the couple's dream home. It included plenty of acreage nestled in a valley in the Ozark Mountains, and the house had a huge picture window in the living room, overlooking the valley and the forested mountains beyond. The night before, she'd awakened around 3:00 a.m. Nothing had startled her awake, no nightmares, no having to pee, but something had definitely awakened her, something that she wasn't aware of just yet. She lay in bed in the dark for a while, listening in the silence, trying to go back to sleep, but she couldn't. She then carefully rolled out of the bed, trying not to wake her husband, and then she made her way through the dark house to the kitchen for a snack. As she walked through the lightless living room, she looked out of the picture window and froze. There was something standing on the deck just outside, a small silhouette outlined in starlight. She studied the shape in wide-eyed fear as it stood motionless on the deck overlooking the valley. It seemed to be looking up. Her shock turned to concern and confusion when she realized what the figure was. It was her 8-year-old son. She quickly flung the sliding door to the deck open and wrapped the boy in her arms, asking, "Are you okay, honey? What's wrong? What are you doing out here?"
I'm looking at the lights,"
he said. Then he pointed out into the clear night sky. She followed the direction of his finger and saw several orbs of soft red, blue, and orange lights hovering over the valley. They were like bright stars at first, but then they moved slowly, deliberately into a formation. First a line, and then a cross, and then a diamond, and finally something that resembled the Big Dipper. There was nothing natural about their movement. They could not be shooting stars or aircraft. They weren't moving like that. It was like they were some sort of signal, almost as if they were communicating with something or someone. Im released her son from her arms and stood up hypnotized, staring at the lights too, as they changed formations and pulsated from dim to bright and back to dim again. Her son tugged on the hem of her nightshirt and said that he was cold. She broke her trance and took her son quickly by the shoulder, leading him inside impatiently. She slid the door closed behind her and locked it, doing her best not to look back out over the valley. She closed the blinds on the big window in the living room and ushered her son into her bedroom to sleep with her and her husband, with the lights on. Im stopped talking and looked up at Z, who looked back at her with eyes widened in amazement. She began to sob again. "Do you want to hear the really crazy part? The reason why this is so scary?" Z's mouth hung open as she thought about how to respond. Before she could reply, Im continued. Her father was a physicist who'd worked at a government lab in New Mexico. He was never able to tell her what exactly he did for reasons of national security, so to say. While working in the Southwest, he'd fallen in love with the region's harsh but beautiful mountains and desert landscapes. After divorcing Im's mother and retiring early with a handsome government pension, he bought a small ranch in Arizona. In the summertime, Im, then a young girl, would stay with her father at his ranch. It was a very remote property, part of its allure for him. It was in the foothills of some mountains in the desert, but it had access to a water source, and there was a small pond back behind the ranch house, overgrown with tall cattails. Early in the afternoon one summer day, Im's father left the ranch to run some errands in the nearest town. It was a brutally hot day, and Im did not want to ride in the stifling hot truck, so she begged her father to let her stay so she could swim in the pond. Reluctantly, he agreed. Once her father had left, Im put on her bathing suit and made her way down a small path of hot rocks and sand to the pond behind the house. The sky was almost impossibly blue in the clear, torturous Arizona summer heat. A slight breeze rustled the reeds and scrub brush, but it was otherwise silent, as if all the animal life had perished or gone underground to escape the relentless desert heat. As Im rounded the bank of cattails that obscured the pond from the house, she froze at an unexpected encounter. 3 tall beings were standing on the opposite side of the pond. They were all identical and stood facing her as she came into view, as if they'd been waiting for her. Im couldn't move. Whether that was from pure fear or something else, she couldn't tell. All she could do was stare in horror and disbelief at these things. They stood about 7 feet tall, each one completely indistinguishable from the other, as if they were clones or triplets or mirrored images of each other. They were vaguely humanoid, 2 unusually long and skinny arms that ended in spindly hands with long fingers, 2 long and thin legs, slender, elongated torsos, and skinnier necks. Their heads were long but proportional to the height and build of these things, whatever they were. They had ruddy tan and completely hairless skin, and wore what seemed to be blue skin-tight jumpsuits. But the strangest and most awful aspect of these things were their faces. They were completely featureless save for the eyes. No mouth, no ears, no nose. Just 2 somehow human-looking, but somehow not human-looking, eyes set into the blank tanned plane of their faces, staring dispassionately and motionlessly at him. She blinked once, and soon found herself lying on the floor of her father's living room, right on her back. She was wrapped in the towel she'd taken with her to the pond, as if she'd been swaddled in it. The sun had gotten significantly lower in the sky. She could tell by the way it slanted in through the yellow blinds of the windows at a long angle. She sat up, confused and beginning to panic. She heard the ticking of the old grandfather clock and looked over at it. The time read 5 p.m. She'd somehow lost nearly 3 hours of time. How's that possible? How had she even gotten back to the house? Just as strangely, she was completely dry. Not a bead of sweat had gathered on her, even though her father's house lacked air conditioning and was sickly hot. Her father arrived not long afterward, pulling his truck down the long driveway of the ranch. When he entered the house with his sack of groceries, he found him in a state of distress. She told him in a panicked frenzy what she'd seen, what had happened to her at the pond, how she'd somehow lost 3 hours of her life. The old physicist stared coldly into the distance, waiting for his daughter to finish the story, then told her, "But they told me they'd leave you alone." Em was shaking and began to cry again. Z held her and she buried her face in Z's arms. "That's why I'm afraid," she said. "I'm afraid that they came back for my son."